Repser Jasmine Crockett entered the room with a quiet confidence that didn't need to be announced. Known for her sharp legal mind and clear communication, she wasn't one to seek confrontation for attention's sake. But that day, it was clear she had something to say, and she wasn't going to let the moment pass. Surrounded by political allies, reporters, and a few close observers, she took her time, letting the silence stretch before she spoke. The tension in the room was already high, and all eyes slowly turned toward her. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke the way someone does when they know exactly what they're saying and why they're saying it. Calm, deliberate, and direct. Her words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were grounded in something many in the room weren't expecting, a sense of real accountability. She began by addressing the atmosphere, the way political theater had taken over meaningful dialogue. Then, without hesitation, she turned her attention directly toward him. Not with disrespect, but with clarity. "You've built a career, a movement, on the idea of being a truth teller," she said, locking eyes across the room. "But every time someone calls out the inconsistencies, every time someone holds up a mirror, you flinch, you redirect, you attack. That's not strength. That's fear hiding in a loud voice." The room shifted. Aides froze. A few phones discreetly began recording. Her words weren't personal jabs. They were observations backed by facts, patterns, and public record. She referenced how criticisms were often deflected with vague answers or counterattacks. She pointed out how questions about accountability were twisted into claims of persecution. She didn't quote headlines. She brought receipts. Then came the line that stayed with many people in the room. "For a man who claims to speak for the forgotten, why do you silence every voice that disagrees with you?" It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, not out of anger, but conviction. She didn't stumble. She didn't pause for effect. She laid out a clear, simple challenge. Respond with substance, not spectacle. That moment didn't just surprise the room. It seemed to throw him off completely. Up until that point, he had maintained control, dominating the conversation, guiding the energy in the room like he often did. But when Crockett confronted him, it was like the usual defenses didn't hold. He wasn't being attacked by another headline or an anonymous source. This was someone standing 10 feet away, speaking directly, without fear. Observers noted the way the atmosphere changed. Some described it as a freeze frame, a moment where time paused briefly, where the balance of power in the room tipped, even if just for a second. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't double down or talk over anyone. Once she said her piece, she leaned back slightly, allowing silence to settle where applause might have been in a different context. There was no grand reaction from her afterward. She didn't play to the cameras or lean into theatrics. Her goal wasn't to embarrass, but to expose a contradiction, to hold someone accountable not just for words spoken, but for actions taken and responses given over years. Those in attendance described her approach as surgical. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic, intentional, and focused. Her legal background showed, not in jargon or technicalities, but in the way she built her case point by point, leading up to the confrontation. She wasn't bluffing, and everyone could feel it. In a political environment where shouting matches often replace real conversations, her calm, assertive tone stood out. She made it clear that speaking truth to power doesn't have to come in the form of noise. Sometimes it arrives like a quiet storm, clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. The moment after Rep. Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, there was a heavy stillness in the room, the kind that signals something unexpected has just happened. For someone who had long thrived in chaos, unpredictability, and confrontation, the reaction was uncharacteristic. There was no clever deflection, no witty comeback, no attempt to recenter the spotlight with a signature quip. Instead, there was a pause, brief but telling, followed by an outburst that caught even his own aides off guard. He started with a scoff, brushing off the confrontation as if it were beneath him, but it was clear he had been rattled. His voice, usually controlled even when aggressive, began to rise in pitch and volume. What began as dismissive remarks turned quickly into a rambling defense, A verbal scattershot aimed in every direction except the one that mattered, directly addressing the question he had just been asked. There were accusations, vague generalizations, about political enemies, and familiar refrains about how unfairly he had been treated. But missing was the composure he usually relied on to regain control of the room. For many in the audience, the shift was obvious. He wasn't in command of the moment. He was reacting, emotionally, defensively, and in some ways, desperately. At one point, he pointed across the room, not directly at Crockett, but toward the general space she occupied, accusing unnamed opponents of planting narratives and attacking American greatness. His words didn't build toward any coherent argument. They spiraled, each sentence less connected than the last, each point more focused on grievance than response. Observers later described the outburst as thin-skinned and rattled, especially considering how it followed a calm and focused critique. Normally, he thrived under attack, using pressure as a platform to assert dominance or redirect the narrative. But this time felt different. Instead of commanding the room, he was trying to claw it back. The more he spoke, the more it seemed like he was speaking to himself, justifying, explaining, and circling the wagons without ever stepping into the substance of what had been said. What made the moment stand out wasn't the volume of his response. He's known for raising his voice, but the lack of direction in it. It was reactive, instead of strategic. Those closest to him appeared visibly uncomfortable. One aide attempted to shift the conversation back to policy points, but was waved off. Another quietly leaned toward the press area, seemingly instructing them to cut short some of the recordings. It was clear that the reaction had veered off script. The confrontation had done something unusual. It exposed a weakness that had long been shielded by confidence and bluster. Rather than reassert control, he unraveled, not in a way that suggested danger or menace, but in a way that revealed how deeply unprepared he was for a direct, unemotional challenge that came from within the political structure. Not from a protester, not from the media, but from a colleague with credentials and clarity. He referenced lawsuits, investigations, and media coverage in an attempt to suggest that everyone was out to get him. But instead of rallying support, those words felt more like echoes of past defenses than meaningful responses. It wasn't a counterattack. It was a deflection, and not a convincing one. The repetition of grievances, the fixation on being wronged, and the inability to pivot to a grounded response all combined to paint a picture of someone not in control of the moment, but overtaken by it. As he continued, his tone became less angry and more agitated, more fragmented. He circled back to issues that hadn't been raised, dredged up old feuds, and name-dropped irrelevant opponents. At no point did he directly answer Crockett's questions or address the inconsistencies she highlighted. Instead, he painted himself as the misunderstood victim, betrayed not only by political opponents, but by the very idea of being challenged. It was, to many, the most revealing moment of the entire exchange, not the confrontation itself, but the inability to handle it with composure. That loss of control, that moment of unraveling, said more about the internal state of things than any policy platform or slogan ever could. As the confrontation unfolded, all eyes weren't just on the heated exchange itself. They gradually drifted to the far side of the room, where Melania Trump sat. Dressed in her usual, understated but polished style, she had remained silent throughout, her expression unreadable, her posture poised. For much of the event, she appeared to be observing, not participating. But when the tone shifted, when his voice rose and his responses lost their usual polish, subtle changes in her demeanor began to show. Those seated near her noticed. The small details first, her crossed legs uncrossing, her hands tightening slightly in her lap, a faint shift in her shoulders as his tone escalated. She didn't flinch, but she didn't seem at ease either. As his voice grew louder, rambling into tangents and spiraling away from the direct confrontation, Melania's expression, while still composed, changed. Not to one of anger or concern, but something closer to distance. It wasn't the first time she had witnessed one of his public flare-ups. Throughout his career, she had often been nearby as he sparred with critics or unleashed verbal attacks during speeches or interviews, but this moment seemed to touch a different nerve. The setting was quieter, more intimate, without the buffer of cheering supporters or roaring crowds. This wasn't a rally. This was an exchange grounded in truth, accountability, and public record. And when he began to unravel, there was no audience energy to lift him, only the echo of his own agitation. Observers were struck by what happened next. As he continued speaking, louder now, deflecting accusations and invoking familiar themes of victimhood, Melania stood up, quietly, without drama or urgency. She didn't make eye contact with him or anyone else. She didn't gesture or announce her exit. She simply rose from her seat, adjusted the hem of her coat, and left the room. No staff followed. No words were exchanged. Her exit was brief and silent, but its impact was immediate. Several people noticed. A few aides looked, confused, even concerned. One leaned over to another, whispering something inaudible. It wasn't just her departure. It was the timing. She chose the exact moment when the conversation turned chaotic, when he began to show cracks in the image of control he so carefully maintained. After the event, sources close to the Trump inner circle described Melania's mood as disturbed and visibly uneasy. Not because of what was said by Rep. Jasmine Crockett, but because of how he responded. What struck her, reportedly, was not the confrontation itself. She had seen those before, but the lack of composure he displayed in its aftermath. For someone who prided himself on dominance and image, the unfiltered unraveling in a relatively controlled setting seemed to surprise even those closest to him. People who had worked with Melania over the years knew her to be measured and deliberate, especially in public settings. She rarely allowed emotion to interfere with her role as a public figure. But on this day, her quiet exit and the expressions that accompanied it hinted at something deeper. Perhaps concern, perhaps discomfort, or even disillusionment. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions spoke volumes. There was speculation afterward about whether the incident had sparked any private tension between them. Some speculated that her departure was a silent protest, a way of distancing herself from the spectacle without causing a scene. Others believed it was simply an instinctive response, a moment of personal discomfort made visible by timing and context. Whatever the reason, it was clear to many that Melania had reached some sort of personal threshold. Where others saw a heated political moment, she saw something more intimate. A man she knew better than anyone, losing control under pressure, not with strength but with spiraling deflection. Her decision to walk away at the height of his outburst became one of the most telling moments of the entire event. It was a quiet gesture, but one loaded with meaning, not just for the people in the room, but for anyone paying attention to the subtle dynamics of power, loyalty, and public image within the Trump circle. The exchange between Rep. Jasmine Crockett and Donald Trump did more than make headlines. It revealed a shift that had been slowly building beneath the surface. For years, he had shaped the narrative with confidence, controlling the pace and tone of political conversations with a mix of showmanship, bravado, and media mastery. He had turned disruption into strategy, using outrage as fuel and treating confrontation as a familiar playing field. But this moment, in a quiet political forum with no cheering crowds or curated sound bites, disrupted that rhythm in a way that felt different. Crockett didn't attack him with volume or spectacle. Instead, she asked precise, cutting questions that challenged the core of his public persona, not just what he says, but how he responds when the script doesn't go his way. Her tone was calm, factual, and undeterred. There were no theatrics, no interruptions, just the steady application of pressure through truth. And when he responded, not with sharp counterpoints but with an emotional spiral, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. What followed wasn't just a clash between two political figures. It was a revealing moment in which the strength of his presence, so often amplified by noise, conflict, and dominance, faltered when faced with direct, quiet accountability. For those who had supported him, it was unsettling. For those who had opposed him, it confirmed long-held suspicions. But for everyone watching, including members of his own circle, it signaled something harder to ignore. The power dynamic was changing. In previous years, even the most serious criticism rarely seemed to shake him. He could pivot, turn questions into slogans, and rally supporters by redirecting attacks toward the media or the establishment. But this time, those tactics felt outdated, almost hollow. His response was scattered, repetitive, and emotionally charged, lacking the strategic edge that once made him a formidable figure in any room. The deflections didn't land the way they used to. The usual talking points, claims of being misunderstood, of media conspiracies, of political witch hunts, didn't hold the same weight in a room where the confrontation was direct and personal. Observers began to note how different the atmosphere felt. Rather than watching someone masterfully navigate criticism, they were witnessing someone struggle with being questioned in real time, not by a political enemy from afar, but by someone across the table. His reaction suggested not just frustration, but genuine unease. That was the shift. He was no longer setting the terms of the conversation, someone else was. Even within his own ranks, there seemed to be a subtle recalibration. Aides who once echoed his every word remained quiet. Allies who typically jumped to his defense hesitated. No one in the room challenged Crockett's questions. No one labeled them unfair. The silence of others suggested that perhaps, for the first time in a long time, the usual defenses were beginning to lose their power. His presence, once untouchable in these settings, now seemed vulnerable. And that vulnerability didn't come from scandal or external attack. It came from a well-delivered question and his inability to answer it with composure. The power imbalance that had long worked in his favor began to flatten. Crockett didn't seize the moment for glory. She didn't try to dominate the space afterward. She simply made her point and let it sit, trusting the truth to carry its own weight. That trust was not misplaced. The exchange resonated beyond the room. It spread not as a moment of political drama, but as a shift in perception. If he could be rattled so deeply by a question spoken calmly, what did that say about his grip on control? If allies could no longer confidently defend his every move, what did that mean for the image he had cultivated? The moment marked a turning point, not explosive or dramatic, but deeply telling. It wasn't about a single confrontation. It was about what it revealed. The dominance he once projected so effortlessly now required more effort to maintain. And when confronted by someone unwilling to play into the chaos, someone who came prepared, the cracks in that dominance began to show. The events that unfolded during Rep. Jasmine Crockett's direct confrontation with Donald Trump may not have involved fireworks or public outrage, but they carried a weight that lingered long after the room had emptied. It wasn't just another heated exchange in a long line of political theater. It was a revealing snapshot of a changing dynamic in American politics. What made it impactful wasn't the volume of the moment, but the clarity it brought to the surface. For years, Trump had positioned himself as a political force untouchable by traditional critique. His ability to dominate conversations, redirect controversy, and rally support through sheer force of personality made him a unique and unpredictable figure. But the encounter with Crockett quietly showed that even that kind of dominance has limits, especially when it's tested by composure, facts, and someone unafraid to confront the narrative head-on. What stood out to many observers was how quickly the atmosphere changed once Trump lost control of the exchange. His response, far from measured or strategic, was reactive and emotionally charged. It didn't match the precision with which Crockett had delivered her questions. It was a reminder that when stripped of applause, crowd energy, and tightly controlled settings, true composure is harder to fake. In that moment, Trump was not the image of strength he often projected, but a man exposed by the simple act of being held accountable. Even more telling was the reaction of those closest to him. Melania, Trump's quiet departure spoke volumes. It wasn't theatrical or staged, it was subtle, intentional, and deeply human. Whether out of discomfort, disapproval, or emotional distance, her decision to walk away as her husband's response unraveled underscored the sense that something had shifted, not just in public perception, but in the private spaces around him as well. Crockett, on the other hand, left an impression not because she shouted him down, but because she didn't need to. Her calm approach, steady voice, and refusal to be pulled into a shouting match showed a different kind of strength. one rooted in clarity, not spectacle. It highlighted the power of truth when it's spoken plainly and without fear. Ultimately, the moment wasn't about winning or losing an argument. It was about revealing the gaps between image and reality. It was about showing how those once considered untouchable can be challenged, and how that challenge doesn't always need to come with drama to be effective. Sometimes it only takes someone willing to stand firm and speak clearly. As the political landscape continues to evolve, moments like this will define more than just headlines. They'll define how power is understood, how it's challenged, and who the public chooses to believe when the shouting fades and only the substance remains.